My father set down his fork so slowly that the scraping sound against the ceramic plate felt like it lasted an entire minute. He looked at me from across the dinner table, that long, measured look he'd been perfecting my whole life, and said, "I need you to apologize to your sister, tonight." In front of all of us, I picked up my glass of water, took a sip, set it back down. "Okay," I said. Just that one word, okay. My mother's shoulders dropped with relief. My sister, sitting across from me with her perfectly highlighted hair and her new engagement ring catching the light, let out a breath and reached for her wine. My father nodded once, like a judge who had just delivered a verdict everyone agreed with. None of them heard what I actually meant. Because okay didn't mean what they thought it meant. Okay meant I had already decided. Okay meant my bags were mentally packed 3 weeks ago, and I was just waiting for the right moment to confirm it. Okay meant that by the time the sun came up over Lake Ontario the next morning, I would be gone, and I would be taking something with me that would change every single one of their lives forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got to that dinner table in the first place. I grew up in a house in Oakville, Ontario, the kind of house that looks warm from the outside, brick front, big maple in the yard, a wooden sign above the garage that said something like the "Our last name family" in cursive lettering. My parents were both from old Hamilton money, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is always quietly there. In the private school tuition, in the annual cottage rental on Georgian Bay, in the way my father could pick up the phone and get a meeting with anyone he wanted in the GTA within 48 hours. There were 2 of us kids, me and my older sister Cecily. If you have a sibling who was always the favorite, you already understand everything I'm about to describe without me having to explain a single thing. But I'll explain anyway, for the people who were lucky enough to grow up in houses where they didn't have to earn their parents' love every single day. Cecily was, and I say this as objectively as I can, genuinely talented. She was good at school, good at sports, good with people. She knew how to enter a room in a way that made everyone look up. My parents adored her in the way that some parents adore a child they see as a direct reflection of themselves. Every award she won was their award. Every compliment she received was confirmation of something they had already decided about themselves. I was the other one, quieter, more interested in spreadsheets and legal documents than in socializing. I went to Western for business, then did a certificate in forensic accounting at Ryerson. My mother thought forensic accounting was something they showed on crime TV. My father thought it was a fine hobby that I'd eventually replace with something more impressive to talk about at dinner parties. For most of my 20s, I worked at a mid-size accounting firm in downtown Toronto. I was good at my job. Not the kind of good where people clap for you, the kind of good where they quietly route every complicated file to your desk because they know you'll catch what everyone else missed. I caught things for a living, discrepancies in numbers that looked clean on the surface, patterns in financial records that didn't quite add up, money that moved sideways when it was supposed to go straight. I was very, very good at that. The problem was that my family's business was exactly the kind of thing I was trained to look at. My father ran a mid-size real estate development company, the kind that wasn't massive enough to be publicly scrutinized but big enough to move serious money through a lot of different hands. He'd been building it since before I was born, and somewhere around the time Cecily turned 30, he started bringing her in. First as a consultant, then as VP of something, then as the heir apparent to everything he'd spent his life building. I wasn't asked, I was never asked, and for a long time I told myself that was fine. I had my own career, I didn't need to be handed anything. I wasn't going to spend my energy being bitter about a seat at a table I hadn't even pulled up a chair for. But that changed the year I turned 28. It changed because of an envelope. My grandmother, my father's mother, who had lived alone in her house in Burlington since my grandfather passed, died in January of that year. She was 81. She was not a warm woman, but she was a fair one, and she had always had a soft spot for me, because, as she used to say, you actually sit down and think before you speak. She left me her house in Burlington in her will, just the house. Modest thing, 3 bedrooms, worth maybe $600,000 at the time. To me, it was everything, not the money but the acknowledgement. Someone in my family had seen me. By March, the house was gone from my name. I didn't notice at first. My father had offered to handle the probate paperwork for me because he said I was busy with work and he had a lawyer on retainer who could make it simple. I was 28 and I trusted him and I said yes. I handed over the documents he asked for. I signed where he told me to sign without reading carefully enough. 3 months later, I was doing some routine financial reorganizing of my own accounts, and I pulled up the property records just to confirm the transfer had gone through cleanly. The house was registered under Cecily's name, had been for 6 weeks. I sat at my kitchen table in my condo in the Distillery District and stared at that screen for a long time. I want to be very precise about what I felt in that moment because it mattered. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been too hot, too immediate. What I felt was something much colder. It was the feeling of a puzzle clicking into place, of realizing that what I had spent years interpreting as my family's indifference was actually something more intentional than that. I didn't call my father, I didn't call my mother, I didn't say a word to anyone. What I did was open a new folder on my laptop and label it simply Documents, and then I started paying attention in a way I never had before. It took me 8 months to understand the full shape of what was happening. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, it was painstaking and methodical, and there were many nights I went to bed wondering if I was just a person who couldn't let things go. But then I would open the folder and look at what I had, and I would keep going. What I found was this. My father's company had, over the course of about 7 years, been quietly redirecting certain project revenues through a series of holding companies registered in Alberta. On paper, these companies existed. They had addresses, they filed the right forms, they looked clean from the outside. But they were shells, 3 layers deep, and at the bottom of every layer was the same thing. Money that had been stripped from projects that my grandmother had originally co-signed as a silent investor. My grandmother had put $1.2 million into the company in the early 2000s on the understanding that her estate would eventually receive a proportional share of profits. That share, which by reasonable calculation should have grown to somewhere between $4 and $6 million, had been systematically skimmed off over the years and rerouted. Most of it had ended up quietly absorbed into the family's personal finances. Some of it had gone toward the down payment on the house in Oakville that I grew up in. Some of it had gone toward Cecily's MBA at Queen's. None of it had ever been declared to the estate. None of it had appeared on any of the documents I was shown when my grandmother died. And when my grandmother left me her house, the last material asset in her name, my father had moved quickly to make sure that too was redirected before I could understand what I was actually being given. I did not find all of this in a week. I found it the way you find anything that has been hidden carefully, a piece at a time, from different directions, cross-referenced against public land registry records, CRA filings that were partially accessible, corporate documents I requested through legitimate channels, and old bank statements my grandmother had kept in a shoebox that her neighbor passed along to me after the estate was cleared. Her neighbor was a retired bookkeeper named Gwen, and she had always been suspicious of my father. Your grandmother used to say your father was the smartest man she knew. Gwen told me once over tea in her kitchen. She meant it as a compliment. I always thought it was a warning. I thought about that a lot. By November, I had a file that was 63 pages long. It documented clearly and with sources cited the systematic misappropriation of funds from my grandmother's estate investment. It named dates. It named amounts. It named the holding companies. It named my father as the directing mind behind all of it, and Cecily as a knowing beneficiary of at least 2 of the redirected transfers, which I could demonstrate through her mortgage records and a property purchase in Mississauga in 2019. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet. But I knew I had it, and then came December, and the dinner. My mother had decided we were going to have a family meeting over dinner at their house in Oakville. She had called it a catch-up, but I had grown up in that house long enough to recognize when a word was being used to dress up something else entirely. When I arrived, my sister and her fiancé, a man named Douglas who worked in private equity and had never once said anything interesting, were already seated. My mother had made roast chicken. There was a bottle of Ontario Riesling open on the table. My father waited until dessert. Then he cleared his throat and said that they had been thinking about the future of the company, and that decisions had been made about the direction of the family estate. He said that he and my mother had decided to restructure the ownership of several assets, and that in order to keep things clean and simple, those assets would be consolidated under Cecily and Douglas's management going forward. He said this the way you announce something that has already happened and is not open for discussion. I asked calmly whether this included Grandma's Burlington property. There was a pause. My mother said that the Burlington property had been dealt with as part of the estate process and that it was all properly handled. Cecily looked at her wine glass. I said, I'm aware of how it was handled. My father's eyes went very still. I didn't say anything else. I let that sit there. Then my father shifted in his chair and said that there had also been a concern raised, by Cecily apparently, that I had been making inquiries about family finances in a way that was destabilizing and not appropriate. He said that in order to move forward as a family, he needed me to acknowledge that I had overstepped, and to apologize to my sister for the stress I had caused her. I looked at him, I looked at Cecily, I looked at my mother who was studying the tablecloth. Okay, I said. I left their house at 9:30 that evening. I stopped at the Tim Hortons on the way back to the highway, got a medium coffee, sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes doing nothing except breathing. Then I drove back to Toronto and I did not sleep. What I did instead was this. I spent the night compiling everything I had into a format that was clear, organized, and completely undeniable. I had been building toward this for months, but I had kept part of myself from fully committing to it, the way you keep one hand on the door when you're not sure if you want to leave the room. That night, I took my hand off the door. By 4 in the morning, I had 3 separate packages ready. The first was addressed to a lawyer at a firm in downtown Toronto, a woman who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for taking cases that other firms found too complicated. I had already spoken to her twice over the phone, careful and hypothetical. She knew what was coming. The second package was addressed to the CRA's aggressive tax planning division. The holding company structure my father had used was not just a civil matter. Some of what I had documented crossed lines that the CRA took seriously. The third package was addressed to the Ontario Securities Commission. Not because my father's company was public, but because 2 of the transactions I had traced had involved investors outside the family, people who had put money into development projects under representations that, based on what I could document, were not entirely accurate. I sealed all 3 envelopes. I set them on my kitchen counter. I looked at them for a moment. Then I put on my coat, picked up my overnight bag, which had been packed for 4 days, and I walked out of my condo. I didn't go back for 6 weeks. I want to tell you about the next part carefully, because this is the part people always get wrong when they imagine what revenge feels like. They imagine it feels like power, like a door swinging open, like standing at the top of something with the wind at your back. It didn't feel like that, not at first. The first 2 weeks I was staying with a friend from university who had an extra bedroom in her place in Waterloo. I worked remotely. I took long walks by the river, I answered emails. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in years because I wasn't lying awake running numbers in my head anymore. The numbers were already out of my hands. The lawyer called me on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after I dropped the envelopes. She told me she had reviewed everything and that the case was solid. Not perfect, but solid, and she had seen far less compelling cases go much further. She asked me what outcome I wanted. I told her I wanted the estate properly accounted for. I told her I wanted the redirected assets traced and returned to the estate before any further distribution. I told her I wanted it done through proper legal channels, not as a personal vendetta. She said, "That's a refreshing thing to hear from a client." I said, "I'm an accountant. I deal in what can be proven." The CRA moved more slowly as they always do, but they moved. About a month after I filed, I received a confirmation letter indicating that a review had been opened. That was all it said. That was enough. The OSC was the one that moved fastest and in the direction I hadn't fully anticipated. One of the outside investors I had referenced in my package turned out to have already filed a complaint of his own. Separately, unrelated to me, and my documentation was apparently the piece that connected his complaint to a pattern they had been looking at in a different context. I learned this not through any official channel, but through the Toronto financial community, which is smaller than people think, and which has a way of circulating certain kinds of information at a particular speed. My father found out something was happening about 6 weeks after I left. I know this because my mother called me 17 times in a single day, which she had never done in my life. I let the first 16 go to voicemail. On the 17th, I picked up. She said, "What did you do?" I said, "I reported what I found. All of it." She started crying. Then she stopped crying and told me I had destroyed this family. Then she cried again. I sat on my friend's couch in Waterloo and I listened to all of it because I felt she deserved to be heard, even if I didn't feel sorry for what I had done. When she was quiet, I said, "Mom, Grandma put more than $1 million into that company. Her house was supposed to come to me. That money should have been in the estate. You know that." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "Your father said it was complicated. I said it wasn't. The legal process took almost 2 years. I won't walk you through every document and every deposition, partly because some of it is still under NDA, and partly because that's not really the story. The story is what happened at the end of those 2 years. My father's company settled with the estate for $3.4 million, which was less than the maximum possible but more than anyone had initially projected given what could be cleanly proven. The estate, which for legal purposes meant me as the sole surviving beneficiary my grandmother had clearly intended to name, received the settlement. The Burlington property was assessed and the value was included in the calculation. My sister and Douglas were named in a separate civil proceeding related to 2 of the property transfers. They settled as well, quickly and quietly. Douglas's firm in private equity did not renew his contract when it came up for review that spring. I don't know if those 2 things were connected. I didn't ask. The CRI concluded its review with a reassessment that I understand cost my father significantly, both in back taxes and in penalties. The OSC matter was resolved without charges being laid against anyone in my family specifically, though the investor who had filed his own complaint separately received a remedy through that channel. My father did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that. Some people, when they hear a story like this, expect a dramatic conclusion with handcuffs and a perp walk. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, more complete. The company he spent 30 years building had to be partially liquidated to meet the settlement obligations. The house in Oakville was sold. The cottage on Georgian Bay, the one where we used to spend 2 weeks every August, where my parents always sat in the Muskoka chairs at the end of the dock looking satisfied with their life, was sold too. My parents moved into a condo in Hamilton. It's a nice enough condo. My mother has a balcony where she grows tomatoes. Here is the part I haven't told you yet. The part that actually mattered to me more than any of the financial accounting. About 8 months after the settlement, I requested a meeting with my mother. Not my father, just my mother. She agreed, reluctantly, and we met at a coffee shop in Burlington, around the corner from where my grandmother used to live. I didn't bring any documents, I didn't bring any numbers. I brought myself and a cup of tea, and I sat across from my mother, who looked smaller than I had ever seen her look. And I said the thing I had been wanting to say since I was old enough to understand that I had been cast in a particular role in our family without anyone asking my permission. I said, I spent my whole life trying to earn something from you and Dad that you had already decided Cecily deserved just for existing. I was never going to get it, and I need you to say that you know that was wrong. My mother looked at her coffee for a long time. I watched her. I didn't fill the silence with anything. I had learned over the previous 2 years that silence was one of the most useful tools I had. She said, I think we didn't know how to love 2 daughters the same way. I said, that's not the same as what I asked you. She looked up at me then. Her eyes were wet. She said, you deserved better. You did. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a full accounting of every small injustice and every dinner table dismissal and every moment I had watched my parents light up for Cecily in a way they never quite managed for me. It wasn't an apology that covered the ground it needed to cover. But it was the truest thing my mother had ever said to me, and I held it. I live in Toronto now, in a different neighborhood than before, a condo near Roncesvalles that I bought with part of the settlement, which felt both surreal and appropriate. I have a small balcony too, and I grow nothing on it, and I like it that way. I still work in forensic accounting. I still catch things that other people miss. I think I always will, not because I'm looking for another fight, but because that's genuinely how my mind works, and I have stopped apologizing for it. My sister and I don't speak. I've made peace with that in the way you make peace with things that were never going to be otherwise. Not forgiveness, exactly. More like a clear-eyed recognition that some doors close, and what's important is that you don't stand outside them waiting forever. My father and I have not spoken since the settlement. I don't know if we ever will. I don't spend time trying to predict it. My mother texts me occasionally. Short things, a photo of her tomatoes, a news article she thought I'd find interesting, sometimes just a thinking of you with no punctuation. I always write back, not a lot, but I write back. I think about my grandmother sometimes, especially in January, which is when she died. I think about the way she used to say that I thought before I spoke. I think about the shoebox of bank statements her neighbor passed along to me, the shoebox that started everything. I think she knew, somewhere in the careful way she managed her paperwork, that she was leaving me more than a house. She was leaving me a place to begin. The family that erased me to protect their favorite had spent 30 years building something they thought was solid. What they didn't know was that the whole time, quietly and without announcement, I had been learning exactly how structures like that fall apart. When the moment came, I didn't need to rage. I didn't need to make a speech. I just opened the folder I had been building for 8 months, sealed 3 envelopes, and walked out into the early morning cold of a Toronto December. The golden child got everything they had planned to give her. She just didn't get to keep it. And me, the quiet one, the overlooked one, the daughter who was handed a role she never auditioned for. I built something they couldn't touch, not from what they gave me, from what they thought they could take.